I am a mathematician, so I'm very pleased and proud to be here, but also a bit ashamed because I know that all of you, you are geneticists and specialists in biology, and I'm a poor mathematician, you know. So the only reason I'm here is because I wrote this book, which was about Darwin. So I think I will tell you the story of Darwin. I'm afraid that most of you will know the story in many more details that I will be able to tell you. But in any case, you know, I was invited here, so I cannot escape anymore, you know. So we'll have to do it. So thank you very much anyway for being here. So I think that what I could tell you is not the details of the theories of Darwin, which, as I said, you probably know much better than I do, but at least the books that he wrote. Because as you all know, in science, we usually don't read books, let me be a little more precise. We don't read the original books. We're not like philosophers who take pleasure in going into reading the classics of philosophy or in literature, for example. Of course, you know, we have to read the classics. But in science, we have a different habit. We like to study on textbooks, which of course give us the latest versions of the theories. And usually we don't go back and almost never, I would say, we go back to read the original works. For example, in physics, I don't think that many physicists have read the Principia of Newton, or in mathematics, it's very difficult nowadays to find somebody who has read Euclid's Elements. And I'm afraid that also in your field, most of you probably have not read the major books of Darwin. And tonight I think I will briefly discuss the four major books that he wrote. He wrote many, actually, an incredible amount of books on very diversified subjects. And I haven't read them, of course, all of them, because it would take a whole life. But at least there are four which are very important, I think, and that they give us insight on Darwin the man and Darwin the scientist, of course. And not only, also on Darwin the voyager, because as you know, he was an explorer, and we will talk about a little bit about the voyage that he did with the Beagle, 5 years around the world. So the four books that I want to talk about tonight are, first of all, the autobiography, which is a small book, it's a slim book, that he wrote at the end. Of course, you usually write autobiographies once you had a life, and he wrote it at the end of his life. And it's very interesting because it tells some of the insight in the discoveries that he made. It tells us also a lot of anecdotes about his childhood, about how he decided to take this voyage around the world and so on. So that's the first book that I would suggest to read. If you just want to read one book of Darwin, probably this is it, because it gives you an idea of the man. But then there's a second book, which is also very important, and it was especially influential in the 1800s because many people read it and many people were inspired by this voyage to do similar things. For example, just to name one, Alfred Wallace, whom, as you know, discovered the theory of evolution by natural selection almost at the same time, or at least they published it at the same time in 1858. Well, he says in his autobiography, Wallace, that the reason why he started to travel around the world, he first went to the Amazon, then he went to Malaysia for many years, it was because he had read Darwin's book. And it's a thick book. It's called The Voyage of the Beagle. It's not the only book about that particular voyage, because, for example, the captain of the ship, Captain Fitzroy, also wrote his own memoirs, and there are diaries of many of the people who were on the boat, and there are letters, for example, that Darwin wrote when he was traveling. But again, this is a very interesting book. So if there is one book that I would tell you to read, it would be this, right? If you want to know about his trip. But then there are the two major books that he wrote about evolution, of course. One is a classic, We all know at least the title. It's called The Origin of Species, and it was printed in 1859, and that's why this year it's the 150th anniversary of the publication. Incidentally, as you probably all know, is also the 200th anniversary of the birth of Darwin, so it's a double anniversary. And it's also interesting because this year is also another big anniversary. It's the 400th year since two major events in astronomy. Namely, in the spring of 1609, Kepler published another of the historical books of science, which was called the Astronomia Nova, the New Astronomy, in which he for the first time published the first two laws, what today we call Kepler's laws. They were published in two different books, and the first two were published in 1609. And this was in the spring of that year, 400 years ago. And in the fall, so exactly 400 years in these days, Galileo started the observations with the new instrument that he he told the Doge of Venezia that he had invented, and he started looking at the sky, watching the sky, and discovering a number of things that, of course, changed the path of science. His book about those discoveries is called the Sidereus Nuncius, the Heavenly Messenger, but this was published in March of 1610, so the true anniversary will be in a few months from now. And it's interesting, I think, that this year we have these double anniversaries in physics, astronomy on one side, and biology on the other side. And the last book that I will say a few words about of Darwin is The Descent of Man. And of course, this is the extension of the theory of natural selection to man, of course, because as you probably know, Darwin was very much aware that there would have been, immediately after the publication of his first volume, a number of reactions from the conservative parties, as we would say today, both in science and in politics and in religion. So he didn't want to put too much meat in the oven, so to speak, on the fire, and he decided not to talk at all about man, except in just one phrase, which I will quote in a moment. But a few years later, in 1872, he decided that the time was right now to devote a whole book, actually, to man, and this is this fourth book, which is considered to be a masterpiece. So those are the books that I've read and that I discussed and told the story of in this little book of mine that Edoardo Mancinelli was talking about a few moments ago. So why don't we start with the autobiography, just to know something about Darwin the man. Well, Darwin was, of course, was born, as we said, 1809, and he was a child, as most of the people are during their life. But immediately when he was already a child, in a sense, people who looked at him sort of guessed, or could have guessed, that he was a special child. Special in the sense that, for example, he didn't like to go to school. Now, there are many special children in this sense nowadays. But he didn't like to go to school formally. He didn't like to sit in class to do homeworks and so on. What he wanted to do, what he most liked to do, was to go in the fields and look at the animals, look at the plants, and what we would say, play with nature as opposed to play with books. So that's what he did. And his father was, of course, a physician, so he was, of course, very distressed to see a child like this, right? He didn't want to have a hair of this sort. So in at least 2 or 3 times during Darwin's adolescence and youth, he tried to address him in different roads, because he thought, that this man, was not good to anything. So at the beginning, he saw that in high school, Darwin continued to do exactly what he did when he was a child. He didn't like to study, liked to ride horses, because of course, he was a little older and stronger than when he was a child. So the father decided that he shouldn't continue the high school. He could stop studying high school, and this is a strange solution, because if you have a child that is not a good student in high school, you wouldn't do as Darwin's father. Namely, he decided, why don't you go to university immediately? That is, just skip, the last years of high school and directly go to university. And Darwin started university. He started to study medicine. He didn't want, but the father wanted him to become a physician like him. And again, after a couple of years, they understood, that this was not what he wanted to do. He was not putting himself, so to speak, in the study of medicine. So the father decided for a different road once again. And again, it's a surprising decision, decided that Darwin should become a priest. Now, I don't know, whether if you start to study medicine, and you don't succeed, then why you should turn to a different job, so to speak, and become a priest. But that's what the father decided. And this time, I think that Darwin took it quite seriously. So he studied theology for 3 years. And at the beginning of his life, and this is sort of strange in the sense that he said it in the autobiography, is almost ironic, that the man who would become the symbol of the resistance, of the battle against religion with his books and with his theories, at the beginning of his life actually almost became a priest. And he was 21 when something happened in his life. Namely, there was this boat, this ship, this Beagle, so-called, that had been in South America for a mission of a couple of years, and came back because the captain committed suicide. Of course, the conditions were very harsh at the time. It's very romantic to think, that those boats were going around the world, in adventurous trips, but of course the conditions were very harsh, both on the people on the boat and especially on the captain. So the captain committed suicide, and this guy that I already named, Fitzroy, took the command of the boat, came back, and when he was coming back, he thought that it would have been useful in the next mission of the boat to have on the boat a geologist. So when he arrived in England, he asked the Admiralty to give him, or to have, to ask people, to ask for a geologist to put on the boat. So they did. And the request, of course, passed from hand to hand. And it started from the Admiralty, eventually ended up in Cambridge, where Darwin was studying theology. It arrived to one of the teachers of Darwin, who was a priest, who gave it to his brother-in-law, who decided almost to go, but then, of course, the wife was not completely satisfied, that somebody would leave the house and home for 5 years, and go around the world. So the teacher, for a moment, thought about it, why don't I go, and take this trip. But then eventually Darwin was asked, why don't you start? And of course, immediately he was not completely sure that this was the right thing to do. But then after thinking about it a little bit, he decided that probably was better than studying theology. So he decided to start. But the father was completely distressed. Here was again the child who was a very bad student, who had changed first the curriculum in medicine and then in theology. And now he wanted to go around the world, for 5 years with a boat. And the father told him, well, if you find me just a single person that says that this is a rational thing to do, I will let you go. And Darwin looked around, of course, very close to himself, in his home. He found his uncle, which was incidentally was just his father's brother. And the uncle supported him. So he said, well, I think, you should go. So they went together to the father, and the father, he made a promise, find me one man, who says it's a nice thing to do and I will let you go. So they decided to start. I'll tell you about the trip a little bit in a moment. Probably most of you already know something about this trip because it was a momentous trip with lots of adventures, of course, lots of discoveries and so on. But then Darwin came back, of course, and he came back in 1836. So he was 27 at the time, and after coming back, immediately started putting in order the ideas that he had been collecting for years through this trip, and also putting order in his own life. Because he decided, or at least, he thought about it, should I get married or not? So what to do? Well, I don't know, probably many of you are married, so they had to take this decision in life. I don't know how individually you chose, but Darwin was a very systematic person. So he took a piece of paper and he wrote in 2 columns arguments in favor and opposite to the idea of getting married. And I will read you some, at least, of his own arguments, because they tell you something about the man, as I said. So let me see. For example, and I'm not really sure, in which column, some of these comments would go. But for example, he would say, certain things, quite unspecified, are good for your health. Now, I don't know what things in marriage are good for your health, but you can guess, and then after that you can put it in one of the columns. For example, you would say, well, if you get married, then you gain weight, for example. Well, this is not true in general, right? It's true if you marry the right or the wrong girl, right? Who knows how to cook. Very difficult to find nowadays, for example. What if it says, if you have children, and if you have many children, then you have to work, because you have to support them, right? This is also pretty bad, right? Because working is not necessarily a good thing. But then there was one major argument that decided him that it was a good thing to get married. And the argument is literally this one. He says, well, there was another one which was, I think, secondary. It says, if you get married in the evening, you cannot read. I think this is connected to the other, to the first argument, that certain things are good for your health, but of course, you don't have time to read. But in the end, as I was saying, the major argument was that I think, and these are Darwin's words, I think it's always better a wife than a dog. So, I mean, with such an argument, he decided to get married, and of course, it's not enough to decide to get married. He had to find a girl. This was before that, right? Because systematics. First, you decide, and then if you decide positively, then you look for the girl. Again, he didn't look very far, because he had this uncle, which was the uncle that supported him for the trip. The uncle had a daughter, so there you are, right? So he took his first cousin, incidentally, and they got married. This was 1839. And 2 or 3 years later, they decided to move from, I think they lived in London, they decided to move to Down, which is a little town in the fields, and he didn't move at all for the next 40 years. That is, this man who had been around the world for 5 years in this adventurous trip, all of a sudden decided that he just wanted to devote himself for the rest of his life to science, to writing books, and not even receiving people. Because for some reason, and of course, the reactions that Darwin had throughout his life had been analyzed by physicians in the hope of understanding which kind of illness he actually got during this trip. For example, when he invited people to dinner, then he physically vomited for the disgust of having people to dinner. Now, of course, it's not very pleasant, if somebody invites you, and then, the host, just simply vomits, because it doesn't like you, and there were only 2 people. It looks strange, right? But this is literally true. The only 2 people that literally didn't make him vomit were 2 famous scientists whose names you all know. One was Charles Lyell, the geologist, of course, was a close friend of Darwin, and the other one was Thomas Huxley, the so-called Darwin's bulldog, which took on his shoulder the task of defending the evolutionary theories in public, because, of course, Darwin was confined to Down, and for the rest of his life, actually, there was nothing much more that we could say, because it was just a life devoted to experiments, to study, to writing, and so on. And he died in 1882. And all these things you can find in his autobiography, which also deals with subjects that at the time were a little touchy, and also today, I think. For example, his ideas on religion. Darwin, as we said, started as a student of theology. When he started the trip with the voyage of the Beagle, it was actually, in Italian we would say, more papist than the Pope, right? I mean, he was really a believer, and often especially the captain, Fitzroy, sort of teased him, because every time, that Darwin would say some natural phenomena, he would have an explanation, a biblical explanation. But then little by little, of course, he changed his mind on those subjects. When he was coming back from the trip, when he started writing the first notes, the ornithological notes, in 1836, on the boat still, well, he started understanding that perhaps, something was wrong with religion. Immediately after the return from the trip, he refused to consider himself a Christian, because he said he understood immediately, well, after the trip at least, that the stories of the Bible, and that he wrote it quite explicitly, were very similar to the myths, for example, of the Hindu religion. That is, literary myths, mythology that have nothing to do with reality. So he detached himself from Christianity, but not from a general sort of religion. That is, until the end of his life, the last, say, 2 decades, he continued to say, well, I'm not a Christian anymore, but I still believe in what we would say today a creator, a spirit that somehow directs the evolution in a sense. But then at the very end of his life, the last 20 years, he became not an atheist. He never declared himself to be an atheist, and actually quite explicitly wrote that he didn't consider himself to be an atheist, but at least he was agnostic, in the sense that he thought that the idea of God, or the problem of God, was something that we could not decide from a rational point of view. Incidentally, just in parenthesis, the word agnostic was made up by Thomas Huxley, because Huxley, of course, was the first defender of evolution, and I think that he himself considered himself an agnostic, but at the time, again, he didn't want to proclaim himself to be an atheist, so he coined this word it's a word that derives from Greek, of course, from the Greek language, and it directly reminds us of the Gnostic of the old times. And Huxley said, well, those Gnostics pretended to know so much about things that we cannot know about. And so he invented this word with the negative A at the beginning, and nowadays we continue to use the word in a general fashion. So that's one of the chapters of the Darwin's autobiography that deals with religious beliefs or non-beliefs. There's a long chapter in which he says he tells about the other books that I would not talk about here, but for some of you, especially those who come from the United States and read the New York Review of Books, in November last year, November 2008, there was a wonderful paper by Oliver Sacks that some of you may have read about the books that Darwin wrote about plants. And there are a good deal already, and Sacks, of course, read them all, and he wrote this wonderful chapter, so to speak, of the biography of Darwin. But the autobiography, as I said, it's a very slim book. It just gives you the skeleton of his life. Instead, The Voyage of the Beagle is a wonderful book of adventures, and it tells about this voyage that he did with this boat between 1831 and 1836. They didn't know when they started how long the trip would last, but eventually, as I said already 2 or 3 times, it lasted 5 years. And it was a trip that actually started from England, of course, went down to South America. For 2 or 3 years, actually, they just stayed on the what we call the south cone of South America, because the main objective of the trip was not to do geological or naturalistic research. It was just to trace the borders of the coasts. And it is interesting to think that it's only 200 years ago, it's actually less than 200 years ago, and still the coasts of South America were not completely known, and the Admiralty, of course, needed it for political and also military purposes. So those boats were going up and down along the coast. And that's why Darwin had a lot of free time, because often he would just disembark from the boat and stay on the land for weeks and sometimes even months. And he had adventures of all kinds, which he tells in details in the book, The Voyage of the Beagle. For example, in Argentina, he ended up in a revolution. He met with General Rosas, who at the time was just an insurgent, but then eventually became the dictator of the country. There were even naturalistic events that he narrates in a very literary mood. For example, in Concepcion, on the other coast, on the western coast of South America, he was a witness of a terrible earthquake which produced a tsunami like the one that we've seen a few years ago. And he saw all those disasters with his own eyes. Sometimes instead there were positive events. For example, he says in a page which I always remember, that one day he saw snowing butterflies. That is, there was a number of butterflies so big, a bunch of butterflies of kilometers inside and a few hundred meters in height, that looked like a giant, how do you say chame in English? Well, giant flock or whatever, right? And the impression that they gave, it was like it was snowing butterflies and so on. But of course, the most important thing that Darwin did in South America on the land was to start noticing that the theories of Lyell, we already quoted Charles Lyell as a friend of Darwin, but he became a friend after the end of the trip. And Lyell had just published the first book of the Principle of Geology. And as you know, in that book, there were already a few ideas that, in a sense, Darwin took and made his own in the theory of evolution, namely the idea that little changes in a long time then can produce big changes from the point of view of geology, geological changes. And at the beginning, not many people believed the theories of Lyell. And it's also interesting that when Darwin started to write his own theories, Lyell didn't believe the theories of Darwin either. I mean, so in the sense, it was difficult to change the paradigm that people had in mind. But Darwin had the first volume of Lyell's book with him in the trip, because he was a present when they started the trip by Captain Fitzroy. And by reading this book and by observing what he actually saw with his own eyes in South America, he started converting, so to speak, to the theories of Lyell, and that was one of the major steps that led him to the idea of evolution eventually. But the most important leg of the trip of the Beagle, as you probably know, was a very short leg, actually, just 5 weeks in 1835, while they were actually already coming back from South America, and they were heading toward England. Of course, it took him a whole year to come back, but at the beginning of the year, in January 1835, they stopped for 5 weeks in the Galapagos. Now, some of you may have been there, and you probably know because you've seen television movies or reports. Those are very special islands. They've been isolated for centuries and millennia, and they have a very special flora and fauna. And when Darwin got there, he had one of the major clues of that trip. The story is quite strange because the Galapagos that today are like a heaven for tourists, of course, everybody dreams of going there. I had the good fortune of being there a couple of years ago with children, because we took a bunch of children for the Italian television to teach them, so to speak, the rudiments of the evolution in the place where Darwin actually concocted them, so to speak. But those are wonderful places, but at the time they were just a penal colony. So there were around 200 convicts from Ecuador, because then as now the Galapagos are part of Ecuador. And the superintendent of the colony once told Darwin a phrase that he actually reported in his diary, and at the moment didn't have any particular effect. But then, thinking about it later, he discovered that there was something very special. Namely, the superintendent told him, well, as you know, in the Galapagos there are those giant turtles. And he said, well, I can recognize the turtles by some aspects of their physical aspects, little differences one from the other. I can recognize the island they come from. And when Darwin was coming back from the Galapagos, he started thinking about this, and he said, well, that's very strange, because at the time, of course, the major idea was the fixist idea of Linnaeus, that every species, all species had been created by God, independently, and there was no possibility for one species to evolve in another. It was a fixist theory in this sense, the creationist and fixist at the same time. That is, God created each individual species, and they were unmovable, so to speak. And the idea that there were so many turtles, so similar one to the other, and that the characteristic of the turtles were actually related to the island they came from, well, this was one grain of sand, in a sense, that was put in the oyster of Darwin's mind, and that eventually produced the pearl of evolution. There were also other observations that Darwin made always in the Galapagos, and that's why the Galapagos had become some symbol of the theory of evolution, and they have to do with the finches. At the time, again, Darwin didn't notice anything in particular. He was collecting specimens from all over the places, and he took a number of birds, in particular finches. But when he got back to England, he gave them to an ornithologist, and he examined those birds, and he discovered that there were 13 different species of finches. Again, very similar one to the other. The main differences were just the form and the strength, the measures, the length of the beak. And the discovery, again, that little differences actually could identify the island where the finches came from. Again, was another clue that Darwin got for the theory of evolution. Now, obviously, there were many others. And he explains in the autobiography more or less how he got to the idea. And he says that immediately after coming back in 1836, he started taking notes, revising the things that he had written through the years, through those 5 years. And eventually, already in 37, beginning of 38, he had the main idea of mutations, first of all, and evolution. And we're talking about 1838, 1839, so this is 20 years before he actually published this book, The Origin of Species. What happened in between? Well, he could have published at least the theory in the 1840s. Certainly an article like the article of Wallace, which was the article that was published in 1858 together with another article by Darwin that disclosed the idea of evolution, could have been written and published at the time. But Darwin wasn't sure at the time. He wanted to have experiments, and for 20 years he did experiments on his own in his own home in Down. But of course, he corresponded with a number of people throughout the world, and he was writing very leisurely a book which he says could have become 4 or 5 times longer than The Origin of Species. Now, I think that at least you have seen the book of Darwin. It's a tome like this, 500, 600 pages, depending on how you print it, right? Well, he says, the original book, should have been 5 or 6 times longer. But as I said, in 1858, he received a letter from Malaysia by Alfred Wallace, and in this letter, the main argument of evolution by natural selection was already forecast. So Darwin was distressed. He understood, he had been waiting for 20 years to publish his theory, and now, somebody else, was coming first, so to speak. But both Lyell and Huxley were adamant. They said, well, we all know that you have been studying and working on this theory. Luckily, he had some notes which he had written in 1842. He had letters that he had wrote to friends. So they took excerpts from a letter to the biologist Gray. They took excerpts from the notes of 1842, and they put it together with this article of Wallace in 1858. And Darwin eventually, became the discoverer of this new theory together with Wallace. So there was no reason anymore to wait to finish the book, and he decided that he would actually cut it drastically and publish it as soon as possible. So he published it in 1859, and this is the book that we all know about, at least in theory, The Origin of Species. Is a book that, of course, changed the history of biology and the history of science. I think that there are very few books that have a similar status in the history of science. The only one I can think of is the Dialogue of Galileo, which was written in 1632. And the two books are very similar in a sense. They're scientific books that tell about detailed scientific theories. But they do it, Galileo was writing in Italian, and at the time, this was one of the accusations that were made against him, that he wrote in Italian so that everybody could read it instead of writing in Latin only for the literate people. And Darwin, of course, wrote in English. This was already half of the 19th century. But the two books are very similar. There's no formula in any of them, including Galileo, which in the end, was writing about astronomy and about physics. And those are masterpieces, I think, of exposition, of scientific exposition. Two books that I think everybody should read once in their lifetime, just to understand, the feeling of science in the being, so to speak, in being created. And the book of Darwin is an experience if you read it. First of all, it starts very interestingly with a preface in which he names at least 35 predecessors. He doesn't claim to be the first inventor or discoverer of the theory of evolution. He knows that many people before him had at least some of the ingredients of his theory. And he quotes 35, but he says there are many more. And the thing that surprised me most is that in one note, in the first page of the book, in this preface, he has a quotation, and it's a quotation that it talks about teeth, and says, well, why do we have some teeth sharp and some other teeth flat? Certainly not because they were made so that the sharp teeth could actually bite and the flat teeth could chew, but simply because nature provided us with different kind of teeth, and the ones that were useful were, so to speak, selected, and the ones that were not useful were discarded by nature. And then Darwin reveals where the quotation comes from. And one could think, well, it could be Diderot or it could be Buffon, that, as we know, have been predecessors. But instead, this is a quotation from Aristotle, and it comes from the physics. And it's quite surprising, that not only Aristotle did it, but Darwin actually claims, well, some of the main ingredients of the theory of evolution were already known to the Greeks. And this is surprising only for those, for example, who have forgotten that the same happened also for the heliocentric theory, namely for the other book of Galileo and of Copernicus. Aristarchus already had the theory that Copernicus was defending in the middle of the 1500s. And so we have to think about and rethink probably the idea that we have of the history of science and of what the Greeks did. But anyway, so that's the beginning of Darwin's book, an homage, so to speak, to the predecessors, to the people, to the scientists and philosophers that preceded him. And then the first chapter of the book, again, it's an interesting thing because Darwin proceeds by analogy. It's a chapter on artificial selection. He tries to convince the reader, and of course, today we're all convinced, but probably at the time not. So 150 years ago, people were not convinced that there was evolution at all, and in particular that there was an artificial selection. And Darwin gives a number of examples showing how both with vegetables, with plants, and with animals, it's possible to select particular characters, and that's exactly what has been done for centuries and millennia. And then he says, well, this could be the same mechanism, the same mechanism that man has used to select characteristics of plants and animals. The same mechanism could be the mechanism that nature uses to select different species for plants and animals. And of course, this is not an argument, as you know. This is just an analogy, Well, it could have been so, but is it really so? And the rest of the book is, well, the first third is an exposition of the theory of natural selection. It's not very long because, as I said, the article, for example, of Wallace was just a few pages. If you just want to give the skeleton of the ideas, you can actually do it quite easily. But the interesting thing for me is that the other 2/3 of the book, so 350 pages, 400 pages, are devoted to answering objections that Darwin himself had proposed to himself, and that other people, because of course the book had many different editions, that other people had objected to him. And if you read it today, you find the answers to most of the objections that the fundamentalists, for example, still continue to propose against the theory of evolution. The missing rings, so to speak, or the complexity of the eye, and so on. You want to know what time is it, or are you telling me that I should know? Okay, because he said so. And that's what Darwin said, what Darwin did in the Origin of Species. I understand that we all have to go to dinner, so I will just say a few words about the last book, which I won't suggest to read instead, because I said that the Origin of Species is one of the books that you have to read once in your lifetime together with Galileo. I would say also together with Newton's Principia, but that's a different thing because Newton's wrote for mathematicians, so it's a completely different story to read Newton. But to read Galileo and Darwin is something that we can do it, and so we have to do it. Instead, the descent of man is the application of the theory of evolution, as I said, to man. And as you might imagine, is very controversial. There are pages that I won't read to you, not only because it's late, but also because it's embarrassing, in which Darwin puts forward ideas that today, would be quite difficult to defend. But in a certain sense, one can see there, the seeds of a number of disciplines that in the last 150 years have been flourishing. for example, the relationship between psychology and evolution, the relationship between man and animals. One of the big arguments that he makes at the beginning in the first 100 pages of the book is to show how much we humans are actually similar to animals, and conversely, which is even more intriguing in a sense, how much the animals, and especially the higher mammals, are similar to man. And he claims practically that there is no characteristic of man that already is not present in some animals, especially in some monkeys, in some anthropomorphic monkeys, at least in some degree, of course. He's not claiming, that animals have exactly the same characteristic of man. But of course, even things like language, affection, memory, and at the end, even religion. And he draws a very interesting, at least for me, very interesting parallel between the relationship between a dog, there we go again, we already quoted dogs before, between dogs and man on one side, and man and God on the other side. And the claim is that, in a sense, the relationship that the dog has to the man is a religious relationship, is a sort of a religious feeling, and so even religious that we think, is... Yes, please sum up. And of course, for a mathematician, this is an invitation to, because, sums are the things that we do better, so, and subtractions. So, okay. But anyway, there's not much time, as I understand, to tell you more about the descent of man, nor about as I said, the immense quantity of books that Darwin wrote. I think that I can just say, that it's been a pleasure to be here. I hope that at least, some of the facts that I gave, were not known to you, but I know that probably, each of you could have given, a better lecture on Darwin, so please excuse me, and thank you very much.
I understood that, all of us understood that we are coming from the million years just now. So there's an evolution under the guidance of the God, or nature did it. But just now we are having lots of possibility with the support of the technology and science to interfere with the evolution. So I want to learn your ideas as a mathematician, or maybe Dr. Breckman can tell us something about the future. What's going to happen? Are we going to be immortal, or we are going to destroy something? What we should do from now on?
I think the easiest way to answer would be to quote Niels Bohr, who says once, that it's always difficult to do forecasts, especially about the future. So, but certainly I'm not the person to ask. Maybe Professor Boncinelli or others, We quoted two kinds of selections, and one was artificial selection, and the other one is, of course, related to Darwin's work, which is natural selection. But Darwin already introduced a third kind of selection, which is sexual selection, and in particular, the second book that I quoted, the last book that I quoted, The Descent of Man, is mostly devoted to sexual selection, because this is a subject that he didn't deal with in the first book, The Origin of Species. So after the first part of The Descent of Man, he starts with a new argument, and most of the book is actually devoted to sexual selection in animals, to come to the end, and explain some of the characteristics of man which would be inexplicable according to natural selection. Well, of course, the peacock's tail, well, not that the peacocks are men, right? But peacock's tail is the main example of sexual selection, right? Which goes in principle against natural selection. And you have to explain, for example, characteristic of man, like the color of the skin, some features like, for example, the presence of breasts in females, female, or the presence of the beard in men, and so on, and especially those characteristics that appear in the development of the individual after the adolescence, right? And Darwin draws a connection there with sexual selection. Those are three kinds of selection, so artificial, natural, and sexual. But of course, I think that today we are all very much aware that there is a fourth kind of selection, which is cultural selection. And cultural selection often goes against what we would call natural selection. Darwin, for example, in his book is very explicit. He says, well, we are the only species that, for example, decides not to kill or not to let die the individuals which are weaker, and or less fortunate, less lucky, right? And he says it in a way which today to us sounds very racistic, so to speak, and very politically incorrect. But it could be all reinterpreted, I think, in terms of cultural selection. This is just a witnessing the fact that often the culture of man is going against the selection that nature would do, and certainly cultural selection is changing our species in ways much faster than nature has done in the last centuries. So certainly I think the future will be mostly directed by culture than by nature. What I find interesting is that, for example, the church continues to preach in favor of a life which will be not against nature. And that's the formula, so to speak, that the Pope uses, in particular, for example, for the condemnation of homosexuality. And I think that the church doesn't understand, that culture is precisely this, going against nature, introducing a new kind of selection that, exactly like sexual selection, could go against the natural selection and produce different beings. But that's the most I can say about the future, which is...
I think that protocol dictates that I sum up, at least in a genetical or a medical sense of the word, and then we'll stay on target because we're keeping people from here to the wine, which is a big gala. I think what we've heard today is a spectacular disposition of a wonderful scientist that is arguably the reason we're all in a room together. We've learned that he had some benefits that perhaps we don't have right now. We've learned that he can get away with homeschooling, which is tough to do, at least in America these days. We've learned that he can take his postdoc in a remarkable fashion. Dr. Menger took his postdoc in La Jolla, but I suspect he didn't spend 2 years on a boat, or certainly 5 years on a boat, but rather in a laboratory. We learned that once Darwin came back, he did not have to worry about committee meetings or peer review processes. And clearly, had he been worried about writing grants, then his preliminary data would have occurred much quicker than the 20 years that it took. So he had a lot of benefits that we really don't have. On the other hand, I think that Darwin had a number of things that all of us are dealing with. There was competitive science. Once he found out that Wallace was about to scoop him, he brought in the troops, and whether behind the scenes or not, made it clear that he had provenance on that particular information, and had a wonderful journal editor that allowed everything to be published concurrently, which does happen these days. But one aspect that I think we haven't talked about is the opprobrium or scorn that Darwin experienced. Certainly that was why he waited so long. And many of you have probably gone to the various art museums that have sponsored exhibits about Darwin around Europe and the United States. I know I went to a wonderful one in Frankfurt earlier this year, and you can not help but be struck by the boorish cartoons that appeared in the British media and throughout the world, in which Darwin was part monkey, part human. He was ridiculed. And as I look around the room and I think of the pioneers that have brought us where we are in reproductive medicine, there's a great deal of similarity. Yuri Valinsky just died within the last year, but I certainly remember the scorn that presented him for HLA typing and transferring of embryos, adult onset pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and those of us in the room who have no hair or gray hair or both, such as me, certainly will remember what happens when Bob Edwards started the field of in vitro fertilization. The amount of scorn that was presented to him and to his colleagues around the world is difficult to forget. So I would like to conclude, at least from this particular panel, by saying that although we didn't spend a lot of time in boats, there really are a lot of Darwins in this room, and it's been a privilege to be here this afternoon for this particular program and to hear this wonderful speaker. Thank you very much.